October 16, 1632. The low, marshy shore of the Zide or South River. The air is thick with the smell of salt, wet earth, and the metallic scent of blood. The palisade walls of the fledgling Dutch colony of Zwanendale, a cluster of crude huts and a single larger building flying the flag of the Dutch West India Company, stand silent against the gray autumn sky. Inside, there is no movement. Outside, a lone figure, a Lenape warrior of the Sikonese tribe, watches from the reeds. His hand tightens on the shaft of his war club, not in preparation for attack, but in a quiet, grim acknowledgement of what has already transpired. The colony is dead. Just days before, this place had been a bustle of misplaced ambition. Under the command of Gillies Hossett and a party of 28 men, Zwanendale was meant to be a whaling and fur-trading utopia. They had built a beautiful, ornate facade on their main house, crowned with a giant wooden statue of a walrus. They had planted gardens in the unfamiliar soil, and they had, with catastrophic misunderstanding, adhered too literally to their company instructions. When a local sachem approached with a ceremonial gift, presenting a totem, a carved insignia of his lineage to be displayed as a sign of alliance, the Dutch saw only a primitive wooden board. Following orders to mark all company property, they nailed the sacred tribal emblem to their gatepost. It was an act of profound, unwitting desecration. The retaliation was not a frenzied massacre, but a precise and deliberate erasure. The Lenape warriors did not charge, they simply arrived. They did not scream, they fought in a focused silence that was more terrifying than any war cry. The crack of matchlock muskets was swallowed by the marsh, followed by the thud of clubs and the sharp, final cries of the settlers. The beautiful walrus statue was defaced. The totem was removed. And the land, for a moment, was allowed to breathe again, the only evidence of the folly a scattering of bodies and the slowly smoldering timbers of a dream built on utter cultural blindness. The story of Delaware does not begin with a triumphant founding, but with a ghost story. And the first lesson written in its soil was this: to ignore the power, the protocols, and the presence of those who are already here is to build on a foundation of sand and blood. November 7, 1664. The deck of His Majesty's ship Guinea, riding at anchor off the surrendered Fort Amstel. The Dutch flag comes down, not in a blaze of gunpowder, but in the crisp, procedural air of a done deal. Colonel Sir Robert Carr, acting under the authority of his friend James, the Duke of York, accepts the capitulation of the last Dutch holdouts on the Delaware. This isn't a conquest born of battle, but of royal prerogative and a signature on a distant treaty in Europe. The land has changed hands, but the real chess move is just beginning, for you must understand the Duke. James Stuart is a man of immense ambition, Catholic in a Protestant kingdom, ruthless in his accumulation of power and wealth. The lands granted to him by his brother, King Charles II, are a private empire. New York, New Jersey, and these ambiguous lands on the west bank of the river. To him, Delaware is not a colony, but an asset, a strip of territory to be leveraged, traded, or granted to secure loyalty and silence enemies. And so, on August 24, 1669, he makes a play. In a lavish ceremony in London, far removed from the muddy banks of the Delaware, he bestows a massive portion of this land upon two faithful courtiers, William Penn, an admiral who had served the crown with distinction, and himself. The grant is a confusing, overlapping mess of borders, a feudal throwback designed to generate revenue through quit rents and control. But the admiral's son is the wild card. Young William Penn, the Quaker idealist, inherits his father's claim, a claim that is now a legal weapon. When Penn receives his own, far grander charter for Pennsylvania in 1681, he immediately looks at the map. His vision of a holy experiment requires access to the Atlantic. The Duke turned King James II, now enmeshed in political and religious turmoil at home, faces a persistent, principled nuisance in Penn, who doggedly petitions for clear title to what he calls the territories. In 1682, weary and distracted, the king signs them over. With a stroke of a pen, Delaware is severed from New York's shadow and shackled to Pennsylvania, not as a core part, but as the three lower counties. Its fate for the next century is sealed. A subsidiary, a satellite, its identity subsumed by its powerful northern neighbor, all because of a debt repaid and a duke's geopolitical game that had long since moved on. Delaware was born not from a fight for freedom, but from a settlement of accounts among English aristocrats. June 15, 1776. The bustling, cobblestoned square of New Castle. The air is thick not just with the humidity of the approaching summer, but with the palpable tension of a world tearing itself apart. In the assembly room of the courthouse, a group of men, plantation owners, lawyers, merchants, gather not in powdered wigs and silk, but in the somber, determined dress of men conducting a grave and illegal business. They are the Delaware Assembly, and they are about to commit treason. With a final vote, they sever the last fragile ties to King George III and instruct their delegates in Philadelphia to join the cause of independence. But look closer at the faces in that room. Caesar Rodney famously is not there, riding his legendary overnight dash to break the tie. But the others, the Dickinsons, the Reeds, the Collinses, they represent a paradox. They are revolutionaries governed by a deep, instinctive conservatism. This is the untold core of Delaware's story in the birthing of America, a colony controlled not by the people, but by a tight, interlinked oligarchy. Its economy was not one of bustling liberty, but of deep, entrenched contradiction. In the north, Swedish and Finnish settlers practiced small-scale, freeholder farming. But in the fields of Kent and Sussex counties, a brutal, profitable slave society flourished, modeled on the plantations of Maryland and Virginia. This elite, whose wealth was written in the labor of enslaved people, feared nothing more than the leveling impulses of true democracy. Their revolution was a calculated risk to protect their property, both land and human chattel, from what they saw as the greater tyranny of Parliament's taxes and trade restrictions. So when the Constitutional Convention convened in 1787, Delaware's delegation, led by these very same oligarchs, had one non-negotiable demand: a government structure that would forever protect the small state from the will of the larger, more populous ones. John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution, argued fiercely for the rights of states as political entities. The result: Delaware becomes the first state to ratify the new U.S. Constitution, not out of pure patriotic fervor, but because it was a shield. The Senate, with its equal representation for every state regardless of population, was their masterpiece. It guaranteed that the slave-holding, oligarchic interests of Delaware could never be simply voted away by a more populous, abolitionist North. Their rebellion secured their nation, but their true victory was designing a system to forever preserve their own power. December 7, 1851. A frozen, rutted road just outside of Wilmington. The pre-dawn darkness is shattered by the shouts of a posse and the frantic, gasping breaths of a small group of figures slipping between the skeletal trees. This is not the Deep South. This is Delaware, a border state where the abstract line of the Mason-Dixon survey becomes a terrifying, personal reality. Among the fleeing is a woman named Jane, her skirts torn by brambles, her heart pounding with a fear more immediate than the cold. She is not heading north to Pennsylvania, a mere dozen miles away. She is already there. The posse, led by a federal marshal under the Fugitive Slave Act, has crossed the state line. The law and its shackles know no borders now. The Mason-Dixon line, completed in 1767 to settle a bloody border dispute between the Penns and the Calverts, was never intended to be a moral boundary. But by the mid-19th century, it had become the most important latitude in America, the symbolic dividing line between slave and free. And Delaware, despite its nominal status as a free state north of that line, was the glaring, hypocritical exception. Slavery persisted here, dying a slow, protracted death not by moral enlightenment, but by economic obsolescence. Yet the institution's grip on the state's political soul remained iron-tight. Wilmington became a city of schism. Its foundries and shipyards powered the industrial north, while its county jails famously cooperated with slave catchers. Quaker abolitionists like Thomas Garrett operated a critical station of the Underground Railroad from his hardware store on Shipley Street, risking fortune and freedom to guide hundreds like Jane to safety. Just blocks away, pro-Southern merchants and politicians agitated for secession. When the Civil War finally erupted, Delaware did not choose the Union out of noble loyalty. It was held in place by a combination of federal troop presence and the cold calculus of its business interests. It contributed Union soldiers, but also saw its young men slip away to join the Confederacy. It was a state at war with itself, a microcosm of the national conflict where brother literally fought brother. The battlefields of Antietam and Gettysburg were not distant horrors. They were the terrifying, proximate results of the silent Civil War that had raged in Delaware's hearts, homes, and legislature for decades. The true story of the Mason-Dixon line is that in Delaware, it wasn't a line at all. It was a bleeding, open wound running through every town and family. July 1st, 1899. The quiet, sun-drenched streets of Dover, Delaware, feel a world away from the roaring stock tickers and industrial furnaces of the Gilded Age. Inside the State House, the air is still, the proceedings almost clerical. With little fanfare and less debate, the 56th General Assembly passes, an act to provide for the formation and regulation of corporations. It is a dry legal instrument, just 11 pages long. Few of the legislators voting on it could possibly imagine they are not just passing a law, but fundamentally rewriting the DNA of American capitalism and setting the stage for Delaware's shadowy modern identity. The man behind this quiet revolution is not a titan of industry, but a corporate lawyer from Wilmington named James R. Holliday. He saw a future where capital, not factories, was the most valuable commodity. His general corporation law was a masterstroke of aggressive deregulation. It offered unparalleled flexibility. Corporations needed just one person to incorporate, directors' names were kept secret, and most importantly, it established the nation's most powerful and business-friendly court of chancery. A unique non-jury court where complex corporate disputes were decided by a single expert judge, not a panel of unpredictable citizens. It was efficiency as a product. The floodgates opened slowly, then became a torrent. First came the DuPonts, the state's own chemical dynasty, restructuring their empire under the new law. Then, like iron filings to a magnet, the out-of-state corporations arrived. By the 1920s, when other states scrambled to copy the law, Delaware's dominance was already cemented. It created a surreal paper economy. A single address, 1209 North Orange Street in Wilmington, would become the legal home to over 285,000 corporations. The state's treasury swelled on a stream of franchise taxes and filing fees, funding government while keeping personal taxes low. But this came at a profound cost. Delaware had sold its judicial soul to become a corporate haven. Its famed Chancery Court often decided the fates of millions of employees, consumers, and shareholders who had never set foot in the state, all in the name of predictable pro-business jurisprudence. The fields of Sussex County and the wharves of New Castle were now overshadowed by a labyrinth of legal filings, a virtual paper metropolis where the world's largest companies came to be born, to litigate, and to hide. May 12, 1981. The quiet, tannin-stained waters of the Brandywine Creek, once the lifeblood of industry, flow past the towering, castle-like granite walls of the DuPont family's original gunpowder works. But upstream, at a secluded estate near the village of Yorkland, a different kind of inheritance is coming to light. Inside a private meeting room, lawyers for the chemical giant DuPont sit across from a furious farmer named Wilbur Tennant. He has brought photographs, grotesque, unsettling images of his cows, their backs arched, their eyes wild, staggering and dying in agony by a creek that bubbles with strange foam. The corporate men speak in a language of permits, compliance, and acceptable levels. The word Teflon is mentioned, not as a miracle of modern cookware, but as a processing aid containing a mysterious substance called perfluorooctanoic acid, PFOA or C8. The meeting ends in a stalemate. The creek known as Dry Run is not in Delaware, but the company, its decisions, and the epic scandal that will unfurl are woven into the very fabric of the state. This is Delaware's modern, dark turning point. For most of the 20th century, the name DuPont was synonymous with Delaware, its largest employer, its philanthropic heart, its de facto royal family. The company built hospitals, museums, and schools. But this narrative of benevolent paternalism concealed a shadow empire of pollution and secrecy. The case of the Tennant farm would ignite a decades-long legal and medical battle, uncovered by dogged attorney Robert Bylot, revealing that DuPont had known for decades that C8 was poisoning water and people, not just in West Virginia, but around its sprawling Delaware facilities. In Delaware, the revelation struck like a betrayal of familial trust. The very land and water that fostered the empire had become its toxic dump. Superfund sites dotted the state, from the former nylon plant in Seaford contaminating groundwater with C8 to the chloralkali plants poisoning the Delaware River with PCBs. The state's powerful corporate laws, its cozy relationship with its largest corporate resident, were now seen in a sinister new light, as an enabler of impunity. The chemical capital of the world had bequeathed a legacy that was literally embedded in the blood of its residents, a constant, invisible reminder that the price of prosperity had been a slow-moving environmental and public health catastrophe. The struggle was no longer for political independence, but for bodily autonomy against an unseen, corporate-made enemy. September 30th, 2014. A cool, autumn breeze sweeps down the glass and steel canyon of Wilmington's legal district. Inside the sterile, modern office of a registered agent service, a clerk processes a stack of incorporation filings. One request is utterly routine: the formation of a limited liability company for a client in Eastern Europe. The paperwork is flawless, the fees are paid. In minutes, another corporate entity joins the tens of thousands that exist here only as a line in a digital ledger and a brass nameplate on a wall of hundreds. This is the daily, silent heartbeat of Delaware's 21st century empire, the business of anonymity. While the DuPont saga exposed the human cost of one corporate giant, a far broader and more shadowy system has matured. Delaware has become the world's premier destination for anonymous shell companies. Its laws offer a level of secrecy unmatched in the United States. The true, or beneficial, owners of LLCs can be completely obscured behind lawyers and nominee agents. This isn't just about tax optimization anymore. It's about creating legal ghosts, and these ghosts facilitate a global underground economy. That anonymously formed LLC can be used to park illicit funds from Moscow, purchase a luxury condo in Miami for a corrupt official, or launder money for a drug cartel through a complex web of seemingly legitimate U.S. bank accounts. Investigations by journalists and organizations like the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists have repeatedly traced global corruption and fraud networks back to anonymous Delaware LLCs. The state's famous Court of Chancery, so efficient at settling internal corporate disputes, is often powerless, and some argue, willfully blind, to pierce this veil of secrecy when the crimes affect people far beyond its borders. The state legislature, reliant on the hundreds of millions in revenue generated by this system, has resisted meaningful federal transparency mandates. Delaware finds itself in a paradoxical moral position. It is a foundational pillar of the United States, yet it operates a legal haven that undermines the integrity of the nation's financial system and security. The first state now pioneers a frontier where capital is not just free, but faceless and untouchable. The power struggle is no longer between colonists and a crown, but between global transparency and a privacy that protects the powerful and the predatory. The ghosts of Zwannendale have been replaced by ghosts of a different kind, corporate phantoms, woven from legal code and willful secrecy, carrying consequences far darker than any 17th century colonist could have imagined.